Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kalyan. Today I'm coming at you from Lake Guntersville, Alabama. I'm at the 8th Ecumenical Council Conference here, having some great times, listening to some great talks. I was able to ask Metropolitan Theophilus a question. I'll tell y'all more about that later, probably in a future show. Heard Konstantin Zalalas, Craig Trulia, a lot of other great talks, so it's great to be here talking to some World War Now fans. More than I expected. A lot of people here love the show, so I really appreciate that. It's a bit humbling and it's an honor. So everybody here, you know who you are. Thank you so much for the kind words. But yeah, this week is huge. World War III is really kind of expanding everywhere. We see France and Macron and even Le Pen. People are talking about the inevitability of French troops in Ukraine. So World War III is getting closer and closer to being hot and truly global. But of course, we also have big developments in Israel and Palestine with Netanyahu speaking about the imminent invasion of Rafah. Apparently, he's approved all of that. We, of course, have the situations in Russia with the elections and some big things going on in Belgorod, as well as Transnistria. So we're going to be talking about all of this and more, as well as some church news. Of course, we're going to talk about Haiti. But with all of that, it's a big week in World War Now, episode 65. Dimitri, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Conrad, and it's good to hear from you, from a different state, different city, sort of on the move. But here we are, and the news this week, of course, is quite interesting. It's very Franco-centric, which maybe brings us back to like the early 19th century when French was probably the most spoken language in the world, maybe even predominantly before English. But here we are. We have plenty of news about Emmanuel Macron. I mean, everything from the most novel and trivial to Candace Owens exposing Macron's so-called wife being allegedly his husband and being this transgender. I'm sorry to start it off with something trivial, but frankly, it is a pretty big story. I recommend people go watch Candace Owens' sort of expose about Macron's wife, only because, look, it definitely wouldn't matter, and I don't like peering into people's personal business, for example, their family lives, but here we have a Freemason leader of a state, a president who wages war against Orthodox Christianity and against many free peoples and not so free peoples around the world, essentially trying to bring around probably the reign of the Antichrist and all the bad things that come with that. So I think it's good to kind of view exactly who that person is, maybe from, even a personal perspective. So go watch that video. I would recommend it. It's only like half an hour long, but definitely gives you a curious view of Macron and maybe even explain some of his sort of perversions, like from the personal life into the foreign political, right? You can see this man moving troops. Now, troops have been confirmed, French troops have been confirmed to have been sent to Romania. And Romania, as we recognize, it is a majority Orthodox Christian country in Eastern Europe, formerly, firstly, an allied state of the Third Reich during the Second World War, and then, of course, occupied by the USSR in its Eastern Bloc and, a formerly communist country. Now, of course, Romania is occupied by a completely different power, by both NATO, and it is a member state of the EU. So its economy and its military are very deeply tied into this overarching New World Order structure, at least in Eastern Europe. It's one of those vanguard countries against Russia. Especially Romania shouldn't be underestimated given its position on the Black Sea. It always, and even during World War II, I think it had a stronger Black Sea fleet than even the USSR because Stalin simply didn't develop a fleet. So, I mean, when you read about like naval combat in the Black Sea, you'll notice Romanian submarines make a really prominent appearance there. But Romania has a very key position on that front, and we see Macron actually sending troops there. It's been announced this week. French regiments are said to be on their way and in preparation for a deployment in Ukraine, which this was the big rhetorical story of last week, and it continued on into this week, this really hawkish rhetoric from the president of France. And it's really peculiar because he kind of came to the forefront in very similar light to Zelensky in the late 2010s. Remember when Macron became a president, he was like pro-peace, and he has this like, he looks a little bit gay, and he meets up with these like local French gay celebrities and singers, and there's a bit of an LGBTQ vibe to him, which may even be true concerning the Candace Owens story, and now he's suddenly transforming. There is this metamorphosis happening, and I call it metamorphosis because it is quite demonic, because again, his hawkishness is revealed in its war against an Orthodox majority country, which is the Russian Federation. And Macron states that he will be sending troops to the Ukraine, to defend both Odessa. Notice he mentions Odessa, mentions Moldova. He speaks about Moldova coming into NATO. He's completely in support of that. But again, the French troops will be positioned in Romania. So French infantry. And again, we do know France has experience acting and operating administratively and as well as militarily in overseas countries. The French Foreign Legion is quite famous in North Africa. France has had several expeditions in West Africa, the whole entire Sahel region story. which we discussed about Western North Africa last year. Remember when there was the coup in Niger, etc. The French troops are very experienced at fighting in places where maybe even French isn't the dominant language. They know how to administratively run these overseas bases. So it's not even. I don't even think it's a joke or this is a story that should be ignored. I think, frankly, it's something that the Russians are certainly paying attention to, and Putin even revealed that in his recent interview when he said things can really escalate if NATO troops are actually on the ground. They can escalate all the way to a nuclear war, and that's been stated very broadly by him, kind of openly as well, kind of implying that NATO and France itself, Emmanuel Macron, should not be overstepping their boundaries. But Conrad, I'm not sure, what do you think about all this hawkishness from Macron? Is this more about Odessa, Transnistria, or is this just a general, possibly just a distraction, having these troops very close to the Russian border in case the doors are unlocked for a full out World War III type hot conflict?
I think it's no coincidence that this comes so soon after we didn't talk about it too much on the show. We talked about it briefly because we didn't have all the details. There was a coup in Chad that, as far as we've aware, it seems that the dictator there, it was sort of one of those self-coup style situations. He seems to have come out on the French side of things, despite flirting with Russia and perhaps inviting Wagner or post-Wagner troops into Chad. I think he decided to stick with Macron in France for some reason. Maybe that was a display of soft power by Macron and the French government, and like you said, the French forces and their intelligence. But I think between that situation and the Transnistria situation, like you mentioned, I think it's no coincidence that this comes within, 2-3 weeks of both of these events first kind of entering into the news cycle because again, sending the troops to Romania, it's much more likely that those troops end up in Moldova if a Transnistria thing happens, because that, in theory, wouldn't be violating Article 5 of NATO or, getting them involved directly in a conflict with Russia. But at the same time, we hear all about this Poland stuff and Poland building up and Poland and Moldova pulling out of that European arms treaty that will allow them to build up their armies basically however they would like. And so about that, perhaps these French troops are there to move in coalition with Polish troops or any other such likely coalition. Again, we hear about Moldova wanting to join NATO and the European Union. We, of course, have Stoltenberg, the chair of NATO. He is headed to the Caucasus to go to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. So NATO appears to be ever looking to expand more, despite just expanding some of the largest ways it has in a long time with Sweden and Finland. It seems that they're hungry for more. And of course, this is the first thing people bring up when perhaps we posit something like a multipolar world rising or World War III. They're like, what do you mean? NATO's stronger than ever. They've joined more countries than ever. It's like, okay, like we all kind of understand that the animal gets really big, when a cat is cornered, it arches its back, it tries to look as large as possible, despite the fact that if you actually moved on the cat, you're a human, you can win a fight against a cat, right? But I'm not saying that NATO is just a cat. Russia is, a man in that analogy, but there is something to be said that if you quote unquote, it presents this air of, unity and power when in reality, I believe things are a mess behind the scenes as we see in, the American electorate in the election right now and just the general kind of social atmosphere in Europe with the protests over all of the environmental stuff, over the immigration issue and the race stuff, of course, kind of propping up this war machine while so many of these domestic issues are literally destroying Western civilization at home. Kind of says it all, doesn't it? Like, I don't think sure, there's a bunch of libtards and people that are silly and support Ukraine and current thing, Israel, whatever, but there's no like real NATO patriotism. Like, what does that even mean? NATO is kind of inherently an anti-patriotic, I think, organization due to its transnational nature. But the Macron situation is interesting because we've posited on the show that France and Russia have one of the historically better relationships, especially compared to Russia's current and more previous relationships with, the Anglo-American establishment, you could say. But I think the Africa situation really soured the water between Russia and France, and the fact that Le Pen, the opposition, the right wing effectively of France, has now come out supporting Ukraine, saying that they are kind of an ally in Western civilization and we should support them, despite for this entire time she's been in the opposition, campaigning against it, using it against Macron because it was a popular electoral issue, it was something that had opposition. So this is very frightening because it shows that perhaps she's been given intelligence that, goes beyond just the current campaigning, and that if there's a guarantee and knowledge that it's basically inevitable that troops will end up in Ukraine, if you are the right-wing patriotic leader, you are not going to be able to be against that, because let's say by the time this election between Macron and Le Pen rolls around, thousands of French troops have died in or around Ukraine. It's hard to be the patriotic candidate and not basically rah rah rally the troops and rattle the saber around avenging those dead French boys. So it's a really tough situation, and if the Le Pen thing indicates anything, I fear that it's French troops in Ukraine may be more likely than not at this point.
Well, yeah, that's very interesting that you say that because one of Donald Trump's, I suppose, political perks was that he had such an anti-war stance, while at the same time keeping up this veneer, which was very realistic of an anti-war political candidate, trying to end the deep state's wars and being the most pro-troops president, which is very bizarre, isn't it? It's like, I'm going to shut down these overseas bases, even though rhetorically, I mean, he really didn't shut down any bases besides those in Afghanistan, or kind of began wrapping them up. But Trump's sort of anti-war position throughout his last presidency, with his strong sort of this duality there coexisting, was very curious. And I'm not sure if it's very hard to pull off, rhetorically speaking. Even I would say somebody like President Putin, it was very hard for him to keep that sort of poker face. I would say throughout the 8 years between 2014 and 2022, during the May Day victory protests, while people were dying in Donetsk and Lugansk from Ukrainian Banderite neo-Nazi bombardments, claiming that, look, we had this victory day on the 9th of May. Meanwhile, Russians and Orthodox Christians are dying just 50 kilometers away from the border in these cities, right? So that it's very hard to keep that up, keep those appearances up when you're sort of arguing for defense of the nation. But now finally that has been shed, and we're truly in this real position of patriotic defense, at least on the Russian end. But here in France, I think it's very curious. Speaking of defense of the nation, and we spoke about what the French national identity even is, and I think it's very much shifted from, naturally for the last 200 years, it's been shifting away from Roman Catholicism, where the Pope has betrayed a lot of principles of Roman Catholics. I mean, moral and ethical, as well as, I would say, political. The Roman Catholic Church has entirely abandoned that front. So when people LARP online as Crusader kings and whatnot, I don't mean to bring that up because I know it's a bit of a cliche at this point. But in truth, the Roman Catholic Church has really abandoned that image of being a church of fighting Christians who will defend their homelands and will actually fight for Christianity in the physical arena as well. Because what we see, I mean, the recent story, this is just a few days ago, and a very old French Catholic graveyard was desecrated with Islamic graffiti. And this is just on the onset of Ramadan. And again, it could be a provocation. I frankly leave it open, Conrad. It could have been a rabbi, could have been a mullah. I'm not too sure, right? Could have been either. In fact, could have even been both. Because at the moment we do know those Islamic riots that took place in France last year were very, very real, and very, a lot of public buildings were burned, churches were damaged. So it's not really against, and these are not your typical Muslims. These are basically the ragtag. It's like the Mexican immigrants, right, coming over the border. The actual pious Mexican Roman Catholics are actually staying in Mexico and working hard. The ones coming over the border are the questionable ones, especially the young men who are of working age but simply want more gibs and want more economic opportunities in the United States. So really, this question of refugee status needs to be taken into consideration. But it's the same goes for these North African, Arabic, sort of Middle Eastern young men traveling to France and now causing unrest and possibly even spraying graffiti over French cemeteries, because again, it's disgusting. And this happens alongside, right? We hear a story of a very like one of the top French neo-Nazis named Caesar. I mean, this is just about as world now as you can get. So a French neo-Nazi named Caesar joined the Azov battalion, traveled to Avdiivka, posted photographs all over his Instagram. You can find the post on World War Now. You can actually check his Instagram is still up, see his photos, and he posts a photo of Avdiivka and then he stops posting after a certain date. And it's been confirmed he's been killed by the Russian forces, right? And he's a temporary member of Azov battalion. But it shows you, I mean, the guy's buff, tall, handsome, like very, very patriotic, right? But from like a neo-Nazi, a sort of Third Reich or fascist type angle. But why is he traveling to defend the Talmud on the front lines of a very non-French area in the Donbass, fighting for Zelensky, fighting for Kolomoisky, in Kolomoisky's own brigade, the Azov battalion, right? Regardless of what they say, those pagans. You have to just consider that there's a massive deception going on. Western Europeans are probably under the most deeply entrenched and rooted psyop that they've been under for a long time. So the fact that this Le Pen joining Macron story is occurring, and they're attempting to, again, convert these right-wing French people, those actually who are voting for Le Pen and her party, into the support of Ukrainians. It may seem absurd from our perspective because, again, and even our listeners may be like, well, there's no way patriotic French will support, French troops on Ukrainian soil, but you have to think about the brainwashing that has been taking place since for the last 200 years, and even more so since maybe even the Russian Revolution, and I would say so forth and so on. Like it's really deep. These Roman Catholic French people, those truly patriotic, are also being destroyed through mass immigration. Their holy sites are being wrecked, destroyed. It's the havoc is being wreaked domestically through domestic policy, through foreign policy, and it's all one big mosaic. Which again, the further you look at it, the more detailed it gets, the more granular. And once you make out those details, it really doesn't look good for the French people. But again, people like Gabriel de Rochon, they speak out on occasion about his sort of French heritage because he did grow up there, and also Bishop Sabob's Zelenograd also grew up in France because he came from a Rocor family of a sort of post-revolution Russian immigrants, and he came to Russia as a teenager. So we have these patriotic bishops in Russia as well, people who've come from France and they've carried on that French tradition onto the safety of Russian soil, and there they sort of continue it. So there is a chance of a French rebirth, but again, not with these sort of suicidal policies that Macron is trying to push and these principles which he's trying to espouse, where it's support all these overseas countries without supporting what's internally happening in France itself domestically. And also just for the French people in France, is Macron a trustworthy figure, this bizarre character who's dating a who knows what, who's 20 years older than him, and he's supporting very strange sort of political coalitions in the South Caucasus as well as in Eastern Europe. I mean, there's lots of questionable suggestions there about Emmanuel Macron, but he does seem like he's trying to come out as this mini new Antichrist right before his sort of presidency comes to an end.
I like that you mentioned Caesar, the Azov guy that got blown up. Gabriel de Rochon, mentioned knowing him in some of the right-wing circles that are in France, being aware of him and whatnot. And I find it so interesting that you say, like, why is someone like this dying in the Donbass and something like this? And of course, the obvious answer being perhaps this person was always some kind of intelligence asset. Perhaps this is someone that has always been victimized by blackmail of some kind and has been involved in whether it's extremist activity in France to, going to Ukraine and doing this, because there is no good reason to die. And I want to say this as well, because, some of these neo-Nazi type people, these pagans, they'll post like blonde-haired, blue-eyed women or something and be like, this is what Russia is fighting against and that kind of stuff. Look, I talked to like 4 different journalists. I talked to a bunch of Russian patriots that go to the front line, that have been in the SMO zone, that have been in basically every major city currently in, what's called Russian-occupied Ukraine, but, Russian Donbass, Russian Ukraine. And they say that the women in the Donbass are the most beautiful women in all of Russia. And some people say Russia has the most beautiful women in all the world. I'm not saying I'm saying that. I'm just saying that's said around the world, right? And all these guys, they were all saying, oh yeah, all the women in the Donbass are the most beautiful in the world. So this pagan is even fighting against, apparently the most beautiful European women out there. So there's really just no even LARPy reasons to be going out and doing this, right? Like this is just silly. I don't know why there's tens of thousands of them, but propaganda is effective. But I mean, yeah, French troops in Ukraine, that's kind of one of the big things we're going to be watching out for now on the show. And it's a very unfortunate development because frankly unexpected, like France probably wasn't even in our top 3 countries, to see put troops in Ukraine, was it?
No, of course not. And we thought, France would be that country sort of on the sidelines supporting like Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea, or perhaps even supporting some sort of Libya lockdown, just like they did in 2011 when they bombed Libya through their sort of NATO joint operation. The French Navy and Air Force really wrought havoc upon Gaddafi's government and Gaddafi's troops, unfortunately. So, and even innocent civilians for that matter. But yeah, we didn't think France would be one of those foremost countries. And I just want to mention real brief, it came out recently in a story, political commentators in Russia itself, as well as Georgian commentators, have mentioned that at the really top of NATO, there is this division of influence amongst European countries. So the 3 top NATO countries in Europe, which is of course Germany, the UK, and France, have actually divided spheres of influence. And interestingly, Turkey isn't really involved here. So France was actually given its fiefdom of North Africa as well as the Southern Caucasus, which is probably, and this is one of the versions, Germany was given mostly Eastern Europe as well as areas, on the sort of adjoining the Black Sea, including Ukraine as well. The Ukraine falls under Germany's influence. And the UK had presence in the Baltics, Scandinavian countries, and in all those countries sort of adjoining Russia on the north. And so we have this sort sort of division of influence in Europe, which allegedly the Russian political commentators and modern theorists are putting out exists, which is why we see the UK very active training the troops in the Baltic states. We see Germany very, I mean, interestingly enough, despite all the economic issues, is very active in the Ukraine and is at the forefront of sort of arming, working with Poland, sort of having it be that vanguard right before it against Belarus and Russia. And we do see France, for some reason, bizarrely, right, supporting Armenia, being very active in Azerbaijan, and also, of course, naturally, for French interests always lie in Africa, like we've discussed this for a good portion of last year. So, but yes, Conrad, we didn't expect France to be that sort of big cat. I mean, there was always the potential of France being a nuclear powered state and also being on the Security Council, despite losing its empire formally in the 20th century. But still, having its presence so global, at least in the European Middle Eastern context, yeah, this was an unexpected twist, and perhaps I think it goes beyond Emmanuel Macron, and even the next president of France will also push this sort of French contribution policy, I would say, to NATO, which it's growing even more so, I think, as the time goes by.
Well, I want to say kind of the last thing before we move a little bit away from France is that this is really going to influence a lot of kind of our prophecy watch, angle and a lot of our stuff going on in the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, because what people don't realize is that France is moving to replace Russia, it seems, as its main enemy, whereas before it was actually Turkey. France and Turkey are major enemies. That's one of the main things that can explain Macron's adventure in the Caucasus, is that he has been a major enemy of Turkey and Erdogan and their expansion in the Mediterranean and the surrounding regions ever since he got into office. Remember when he was talking about that Pax Mediterranea and all this kind of stuff a few years back, really when he perhaps started his more quote-unquote Napoleonic turn, as Dimitri was talking about at the beginning of the episode. But the fact that France is, moving so much against Russia right now, it's perhaps going to delay, it's really going to ensure that the situation with Turkey and Russia that we know is inevitably coming will definitely only happen after the fall of Erdogan. And I was talking to some monks and I've talked to some people that knew some very saintly people, and they all seem to be in agreement that it will be when Erdogan dies or loses or steps down or whatever. And he has confirmed that he will not be running for re-election in 2028. So it appears that when the Erdogan government falls and Kemalists are put in, that is going to be when we're going to see. I mean, that's exactly what St. Paisios and Metropolitan Neophytos talk about. So France's policy seems to be moving in that direction as well, for a slightly more, we got to wait for Erdogan to go for all of that to happen, because we see the situation in Turkey, the situation in Libya heating up with Haftar, who is the Russian-backed military leader that controls most of Libya, while the other side is backed by Turkey and the US and NATO generally across the board. That's the government that controls Tripoli. Haftar has recently said that the other troops need to go and that it's time for, his Libyan National Army to actually take over the entire country and take power and restore order. And the thing is, France in the past had ostensibly supported Haftar, not as strongly as the Russians and some of these other groups, but they were not supporting the Western-backed military that was controlling Tripoli. And that was because France definitely prioritized fighting Turkey over fighting Russia. But it seems that they're trying to do both right now. And if we then see Turkey basically fall to become a NATOist state, perhaps what they will also do upon antagonizing Russia is cede all sorts of ground and, influence in the Mediterranean to the French. So very interesting times in geopolitics indeed, but we got to go back to the Holy Land, of course. It's never ending. We have confirmation apparently that Netanyahu has supported the imminent invasion of Rafah, despite the fact that we have millions of Palestinians still there, of course. Egypt has not let them onto the Sinai Peninsula. No other Muslim countries are interested, not just because they don't want the Palestinians, but because they refuse to legitimize, the ethnic cleansing of Gaza that Israel has committed. They want those people to be able to return to their homes and be able to rebuild Gaza City and Khan Yunis, which is seeming less and less likely as each day goes on. But what's more important, actually, than this news of the imminent invasion is the dramatic shift from the Democrats in America. We have Chuck Schumer, Jewish leader of the U.S. Senate, coming out and saying that Netanyahu must go, basically supporting the opposition, which again, Netanyahu is already really on the fence with the opposition and the protesters and those opposing his judicial reform in Israel before October 7th even occurred. So the fact that one of the most powerful Jews in America, who is an open and avowed Zionist, would come out and say you have to go, that is a dramatic shift in U.S. perspective. And of course, Biden has talked about how a Rafah invasion would really muddy the waters. The State Department and Blinken and even the Pentagon, I believe, have said that if they go into Rafah like they say they are, the U.S. may have to reevaluate its policy. And this has then baited Trump into, being more pro-Netanyahu, being more pro, Gaza invasion and Gaza operations. So it's really going to frame that dialectic. And unfortunately, I hope Trump doesn't take the cheese anymore, because that could really, really prevent a lot of these huge gains in the polls he's made, because so many of those are due to progressive and Muslim just disenfranchisement and lack of enthusiasm for Biden. And people then looking at the border and these other things and then being willing to vote for Trump. Also an implicit anti-war attitude preventing him from sinking in the polls despite his, ostensible Zionism. So he really needs to not get too involved in commenting on the Gaza conflict. That is my biggest advice I would give to Trump right now, because if he goes all in for Israel, he's probably going to see himself start equalizing again with Biden. And of course, on election night, it's going to be some 50-50 garbage, and they're just going to steal it, right? So that being said, if Trump comes out super hard for Israel, maybe the Jews will steal it for him. Maybe that's what he hopes. And if that happens, then, the things we said about, the possible Antichrist similarities may have to come back into play. Like I said, are we really about to have my reality where Trump saves us from like an imminent Tel Aviv destruction? Like I joked about that when October 7th started, and now it's looking like it could be real. So let's hope that doesn't actually happen. But Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on the whole situation in the Holy Land right now, because we also have, Hezbollah striking the Golan Heights from southern Lebanon, as well as the Houthis apparently developing hypersonic missiles. So it's a lot going on.
Yeah, no, I mean, kudos to the Houthis too for for keeping up their sort of battle against the globalists and the New World Order. I think it's somewhat commendable, and they are the only force in the region at the moment, besides Hezbollah, actually keeping up a sort of active action against genocide, trying to at least prompt the Israelis to stop their inevitable sort of assault upon the innocent Palestinians of Gaza, as well as Rafah recently. And it's very surprising that Netanyahu, during the first week of Ramadan, which is celebrated amongst the majority of Palestinians, has decided to actually move the ground invasion of Rafah forward. Again, we have to just emphasize the bombardment of Rafah has been ongoing for quite some time now, sort of distant level bombardment, as well as just inconspicuous. There's no sort of signaling of bombardment. So when people have to understand is, like, if there's a house and Israel suspects that there are Hamas militants hiding inside that building, despite the fact that the next door neighbors may have no idea of that actually taking place, that house will be bombed, and of course collateral, shrapnel, debris will damage buildings, people, pets, whatever, anything in the vicinity. The destruction is really broad and quite outlandish, nothing like what we've seen in the Russo-Ukrainian war recently. So we just have to take that into consideration. The reality on the ground is a lot more hellish. That's where the PTSD, where the World War I type of mental disorder comes from. Remember when the troops would sit in the trenches and they would just not expect when the next artillery shell would hit, because there simply is no signaling. There's that constant anxiety, constant fear, until it just turns into this displacement. Like the stress becomes too much. And naturally, this is occurring to all the children as well as the adults who, there's millions, thousands of people who will grow up with various mental health disorders and things like that in Gaza, which again, this exacerbates the issue long term. I think it's just quite destructive. But we just need to kind of pray for those people there and pray for the innocents, and not just the Christians. I think all Palestinians really need our support, I think, spiritually speaking, because as the saints have said, prayer sometimes, and not even sometimes, but genuine prayer, genuine pious turns to God for help actually is just as powerful as actually being physically on the ground, giving humanitarian aid, or actually fighting for a certain movement, which is why the early Christians in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, despite the fact that they were present in the Roman imperial force, some Christians simply said, well, look, I'm not going to serve for the Roman legions, for the Roman armies. Instead, I'll just pray for the Roman emperor, and that will be enough. And that was the idea of certain martyrs in the Roman Church, for example, Saint Hieron of Isauria and people like that. So again, these sort of ideas, Saint Conon of Isauria as well. So these are sort of ideas of actually praying for people, even abroad, people in certain situations. It does really go a long way. I just want to mention the fact that Netanyahu's support is seemingly dimming in the US. It's really curious because Trump is between a rock and a hard place, Conrad. He's, on one hand, he has to have a position on the Netanyahu government because it's not being replaced unless Netanyahu is censured or formally impeached in some way, which again, I'm not even sure if that's likely, given the majority that his party holds in the Knesset. He would need to be overthrown internally, which, again, we've spoken about how that could potentially take place. But the next election is in 2026 in Israel. So that's almost, we can say, a year into the new Trump presidency. If Trump is reelected at the end of this year, which again is kind of up in the air because voting and democratic machinations of sorts can come into play. So Trump will need to contend with a Netanyahu government. It won't be replaced anytime soon. And what kind of position would you take? It's just very curious. And we see in the news, right, besides, of course, the tumultuous events occurring in Gaza, in various other places in the West Bank near the Jordan River, there are Palestinians actually heading on pilgrimage to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, to the Mosque of Omar on the Temple Mount, where the previous first and second temples of Solomon once stood in the Old Testament. And we do see the Muslims actually going to those prayer sites. But again, there are a lot of Israeli troops on the ground, lots of police. There's a high chance of, as we said, black swan events, provocations from the Israeli intelligence as well as army. And even, I would say, maybe, and I don't want to rule this out, but we do know Islam not being the true faith, there may be even provocations internally from certain cultists, maybe belonging not even to mainstream Muslim sects, but also just extremists, right? Sort of traveling to Palestine in order to wage some sort of holy war. And in fact, these Wahhabist Salafists, we've seen them active in Chechnya, for example, in the past. People with these bizarre delusions, right, who may actually act upon the atrocities they've seen online. I'm not saying this is a possibility, but who knows? And they could even be intelligence agents. It's just, I wouldn't be surprised if things begin taking place in Jerusalem, because we do see large amounts of Palestinians actually heading into these Islamic holy places through the checkpoints. Of course, they're all being scanned for sort of weapons and bombs, things like that. But who knows what could take place again? It's very sort of weird time at the moment, and there's lots of active black ops happening on the ground in that Palestinian Israeli region. So it's very unfortunate that Christians are kind of caught amidst that, especially since the Great Land is kind of dawning upon us this weekend. On the weekend of recording this episode, of course, it's Sunday. Forgiveness Sunday is approaching, so we do keep everybody in our prayers, and hopefully this Great Lent goes well for everyone, including the Christians in Palestine, Israel. It's just a really crazy time, Conrad, I think, especially considering that, people living over there, they're not even sure if they'll see the next Easter, which is why on Forgiveness Sunday, I just want to mention we will be singing the Easter hymn for those who. And traditionally in the Orthodox Church, that Easter hymn is actually sung for those people who pass away during Great Lent and may not live up to the Easter Sunday and actually get to hear it one last time. So in the 40 days preceding Easter. So that's just a very beautiful tradition we have during our services. So again, I think just a sort of hopeful note to end on, because again, God performs miracles for us and he saves us, and hopefully he saves the people of Palestine from any more bloodshed, and kind of acts mercifully and maybe even softens the hearts of these insane people leading the demonic charge against the innocents.
Well, they say there's only 600 Christians even left in Gaza. So, the genocide in that regard is almost fully complete. And I'm sure, certain Jewish elements are very happy about that. So be sure to keep the Christians in Palestine, the Christians in Ukraine in your prayers. And of course, we see, again, the situation, seeing escalations in Libya. We're starting to see it's like the entire half of the Mediterranean is becoming this huge moon of conflict, basically, which if that's not World War III, I don't know what is. So in that regard, the show, us here at World War Now, we've been tracking correctly, and that's, unfortunate in many regards, but, at least perhaps we can get a bit of a grip and realize that we can accurately assess what's coming, and, we have the prophecies of the saints to encourage us and make sure that we don't lose hope in the midst of these horrible, horrible situations. And like I said at the beginning, I was able to ask Metropolitan Neophytos a fantastic question here at the conference, and I'll be able to talk about that later, perhaps. I want to get the clip and everything from the conference organizers, so look out for that. It was a very good question, and I really appreciated his answer. It was fantastic, so stay tuned for that. But I think outside of the Holy Land, in Russia itself, you mentioned elections, Dimitri. The elections right now is day one of the elections in Russia. The turnout seems pretty high. They claim after day one, I believe it's going to be a 3-day election, that was like 28% of the electorate has voted. The turnout was extremely high in the SMO zone in the Donbass and in Kherson and Zaporozhye. Apparently, in those areas, it was like 58% have already voted on day one or something like that. And some of the big news, though, outside of some of these strange things, like apparently a Molotov cocktail was thrown at a polling station and some woman set a polling booth on fire, maybe she was a monarchist protester against representative government. I highly doubt that. But, besides those things, the real big news is that apparently poll stations have been opened in Pridnestrovia, in Transnistria, according to the Russian ambassador to Moldova. So it seems that issue with the Pridnestrovians, with the Transnistrians, is very relevant in the Russian mind, and maybe, like we talked about, how with the French troops going to Romania, these things may be happening in tandem because everybody behind the scenes knows what's about to go down.
Yeah, I think, and amidst the voting, when people are actually going outside and sort of visiting public places, especially in these border towns and cities, well, of Russia adjoining Ukraine, which we know are quite dangerous because Ukrainian like long range artillery, such as the HIMARS missiles, they actually do hit very long range targets, like 300, 400 kilometers away. This is something which you simply cannot expect, and it needs to be really stopped by a sort of armament shield, but which Russia simply doesn't have across its entire sort of border level. We do see, again, crimes taking place, right? The elections are taking place in Russia, and while they're doing that, Belgorod is being bombed again, public places, no, not military targets. Ukrainians, and these are extremists, of course, under the Zelensky government. Not all Ukrainians, civilians aren't flying military drones, but they're flying military drones with bombs, right? These members of the Ukrainian Air Force, so-called, whatever's left of it. Essentially, it's the NATO Air Force at this point in Ukraine. I think that's the official name. They're flying these suicide drones into Belgorod, into these oil refineries, which are operating kind of next to Ryazan and some of these other areas in Kursk, Bryansk, Belgorod, behind even the cities, because they're kind of on the outskirts of the cities as well, where, again, the people working at these oil refineries, they're just blue-collar workers mostly. There's some white-collar jobs, of course, available in the offices, administrative jobs. These are not military oil refineries. And the Ukrainians crashing these military-grade drones into the refineries are claiming, well, we're doing this to affect Russian economic power and economic sort of superiority in the area. It's like, hello, Russia has tens, if not hundreds, of these type of small oil refineries all around this country. This is simply an act of terrorism, again, hitting civilian targets on purpose, which is taking place, right? And there are reports of very heavy fighting in the Belgorod and Bryansk forests, which is a very heavily forested area between Ukraine and Russia, between Kharkiv and Belgorod specifically. Historically, right, as we mentioned before, Belgorod and Kharkiv are sister cities, and there was this ancient sort of Russia's version of the Great Wall of China built by Ivan Grozny in the 1560s and 1570s, and this sort of defensive line, it was called like the Forest Defense Line, or like the Defensive Notch, it was called, sort of a massive, like hundreds of kilometers long, south of Moscow, protecting the Russian heartland from, again, all of Ukraine was conquered by essentially Tatars, Mongols, Crimean Tatars, and whatever was left was conquered by Lithuanians and Poles. So it was really a kind of no man's land at that point. But Ivan Grozny built this massive defense line, and he would actually personally patrol it with his elite guards during the 1560s. And again, Belgorod almost returns to this defensive sort of city fortress status which it had 500 years ago, which is a very interesting fate. I don't think anybody expected that, even 100, 200 years ago, right? It's very, very strange. But Belgorod now is just on the front lines. Now that that's taking place, right, you have to understand this weekend, I think, will be, it's incredibly dangerous. So Russians are going out to vote, whilst Ukrainians again are threatening. There are reports, besides the bombardment, there were reports of Ukrainians actually calling Russian just casual civilians, old babushki ladies, people in voting age, claiming, and again, these are Ukrainian hackers calling their phones, claiming that we've accessed your bank account. If you don't cause some disruption at the voting booth itself. And we already have those reports. The Russian news media is actually reporting on it, that we will withdraw this money from your account, we'll steal your money, we'll hack your bank account, we'll destroy the content on your phone. So it's just typical hacker shenanigans are being used to cause domestic disruption in Russia, and by the Ukrainian, say, special ops forces, which is very, very bizarre, and again, affecting innocent civilian people. In terms of the election itself, Conrad, I guess a brief word. We're not under any illusions that Vladimir Putin won't be winning. Of course, he will be winning, and it'll be mostly because, again, there is no proper contestant against him, and the closest person with a media presence, I would say, out of all the people actually on the ballot roll would be Boris Nadezhdin, and he's a very interesting character because he actually has a media presence and he has quite a long history. He has several of his ancestors actually have Wikipedia pages. On his father's side, he comes from a family of Orthodox priests. Even his last name Nadezhdin, it comes from the word Nadezhda, which is hope, and it's similar to Pobyedonosov. His last name comes from Saint George Pobyedonosets, which his father, his ancestors were priests, and Nadezhdin's ancestors on his father's side were priests. Meanwhile, on his mother's side, they come from a very long lineage of Russian Jews. In fact, and these are like from the Pale Settlement, so he's half Jewish and half from a family of clergymen, I suppose. Very interesting character. Again, he's a liberal too, so just keep that in mind. But yeah, he's balloting against Vladimir Putin, and even his rhetoric has really softened. He's been against the SMO and against the war the entire time, so he is kind of like a candidate for peace. But this is completely inappropriate, especially at this time when so many red lines have been crossed, and the rhetoric of Zelensky has continued to escalate because this kind of goes into the peace talks, right, Conrad? It's not like the Russians have a choice of voting for war if they vote for Putin or voting for peace. There cannot be any peace while the Ukrainians are while this government in Ukraine is in power, because it is a terrorist government. It is as bad as ISIS and Al Qaeda at this point. They've proven it through practical action, not just in theory. And they've hurt Orthodox Christians to such an extent, not just inside of Ukraine, but also affecting the sort of lay Orthodox Christians and clergy living on the outskirts in Lugansk, Donetsk. How many have died already? It's, the numbers are ever increasing. So I think there is no peace. There's no vote for peace in Russia at the moment because peace can only be achieved through victory in the SMO. And I'm not saying this is because I'm super pro-war. That's just the reality on the ground. The sort of the servants of the Antichrist who are in power in Kiev need to be taken out prior to any sort of peaceful prospects going into the future. And I think that leaves the only option available for the Russian people. It would be to vote for Putin so that the SMO can come to a smooth conclusion rather than have any bizarre interruptions, which would only further exacerbate the damage done to the Russian and Ukrainian people both.
There were statistics coming out that said it was like 69, 70% of the Russian population polled was like enthusiastic or very enthusiastic about, the Russian action in Crimea 10 years ago and whatnot. So that probably gives you a good level on even, regardless of what you believe about the legitimacy of the Russian voting system, blah, blah, blah. That's generally the amount of people that are going to come out in support of Putin in the war. And that's just kind of generally the statistical attitude of people in support of the war, which I think makes sense. And it makes sense if you go and visit Russia like I just did recently. But another thing going on that we saw that we would be remiss not to mention, you mentioned the Bryansk-Belgorod operations and the horrible things going on there that seem to be sort of desperate attempts at propaganda victories from the Ukrainians. So many of these incursions have been committed by German, Polish, Baltic, and other volunteer corps in Ukraine that are part of the Ukrainian military. So we basically means there's German and Baltic and Polish soldiers have entered into Russia proper. This is probably something that has now definitely happened. And amidst all of this, of course, we see Finland completely supporting France's new policy in Ukraine. So all the new NATO members, all of the involved parties are really coalescing around this idea to put troops in Ukraine, despite the fact that now the US and the UK, it's a very interesting phenomenon. It seems that the Anglosphere in many ways was prepared to pull out of Ukraine to focus on Israel, which seems to be what's happening. We see the US and the UK more focusing on all of that. They're less inclined to support some of the Palestinian stuff. Of course, the Germans in their, continual quest to make up for, something that supposedly happened back in the day. They, of course, are pro-Israel, but that doesn't really mean anything. There's no likelihood of German troops there or anything like that. But it seems just as the Anglosphere and the Israel allies were pulling out of Ukraine to refocus on Palestine, France and all these other places really, really pull their pants up and decide they want to go to Ukraine for some reason, despite the fact that it seemed that they were going the opposite direction for a while. So the fact that this is happening now is not a very good sign, because it seems that we're about to get escalation in the two hottest fronts around the same time, which, again, a very World War III thing to happen. But as it gets more and more imminent, it's a bit frightening to ponder. But unless you have anything else to say about the situation on the front lines in Russia, the election stuff, I think we may need to talk about this Haitian situation, which I realize is a pretty funny rhyme.
That's actually really coincidental. I mean, and we will be speaking more about rappers and poets in that particular context, right? Because that is definitely an element of the new Haitian Revolution. But we do need to mention the fact that the Swiss and, of course, the French, the Germans, and the Ukrainians, Zelensky personally, are planning this Switzerland. They are planning the Switzerland Peace Conference, which should take place in the middle of this year, so during the summer of 2024. And naturally, Russia so far has not been invited to the peace conference. So it's just a multilateral virtue signaling trope, essentially. It's not even unlike Israel was invited to the ICJ. They were given a chance to even give their defensive sort of statements there. So it's even more bizarre than the ICJ procedure in South Africa. But in Switzerland itself, it's like Zelensky has put out his 10-point peace plan, which sounds bizarre as heck, right? Considering he's maybe the greatest perpetrator of this war. Him and Boris Johnson, I think, have exacerbated it quite immensely. But Zelensky put out a peace plan, and one of the points in the peace plan is just to kind of show you how unrealistic it is. It is restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity and Russia reaffirming it according to the UN Charter, which Zelensky said is not up for negotiations. So again, this means Crimea goes back to Ukraine, and Crimea, by the way, right now is celebrating 10 years since its referendum, like as we speak, this weekend before Great Lent. So full consideration here that this peace plan is going nowhere. And if Russia isn't invited to these very allegedly very serious peace talks in Switzerland, nothing will take place. And I'm hoping these very serious politicians who have been in power and have received public service subsidies for decades on end at this point, they're very experienced people, lawyers, economists, professors, academics. I hope they understand that, because if me and Conrad do, and our listeners surely do, then perhaps these really smart people in Europe, they're either pretending or they just simply want another virtue signaling event somewhere in the Swiss mountains, probably even a small holiday for themselves. But, one of the holiday destinations, which at the moment is not very accessible, again, is the Caribbean. So the island of Haiti has experienced one of the greatest recent revolutions we've seen, and some of the craziest crimes on the ground with footage. Of course, everybody has smartphones at this point, even the natives of Haiti, and it's looking quite crazy at this point. And again, it brings us, this is part of the French world. If there's a Ruski Mir and a Russian world, there's also a French world, and Haiti is part of that. And unfortunately, it's descending into what can only be described as post-apocalyptic cannibalism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure most people listening to this have probably seen some of the videos. There's the video of the guy getting roasted over the open fire and they're eating part of his calf. Apparently there's a video of a guy eating another guy's Johnson, and there's a whole bunch of stuff like that. So really, really horrible things coming out of Haiti. And the terrifying thing is they're only like 100 or so miles off the coast of Florida. And I can say a few things about Haiti and whatnot. I used to live in the Turks and Caicos Islands, which is only 90 miles south of Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And there's more Haitians on Turks and Caicos than Turks Island natives, because so many of them just come over on sloops and rafts and boats from Haiti and, just live in the bush and live around and just kind of sleep wherever and just kind of post up. And so I hear Haitian Creole all the time growing up. And yeah, it's a French Creole, so it's got a bit of that, French affect. And it's very interesting to hear them speaking it, as they're eating their fellow countrymen in the capital of Port-au-Prince, which is in a complete chaos. Apparently there's a number of different gang leaders. We've got Barbecue, leader of the, maybe it's like the 6ix9ine family gang or something like that. And then there's, I guess, an ex-cop and all these. There's a few different gang leaders and people vying for power. As Ariel Henry, the prime minister, resigned, he was hiding in Puerto Rico, and even the Dominican Republic refused to give him asylum. Dominican Republic, they've been pretty based. All these running over the border trying to get in the DR, and they're just sending them all back, dumping them back over the border on buses, rejecting the prime minister's request for asylum and everything, because they just do not want to get involved in any of this. They're seeing, very high quality of life increases, high GDP growth, and they realize that has to do with demographics. And they're like, we are keeping the demographics of the DR the way they are because we see what the other option is, which is demonic chaos. Of course, Professor Dugan, Dimitri, you posted about this on Twitter, and I had written some about this as well. Haiti is never, there's all these Haas and Jackson Hinkle are blaming, neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism and the IMF for why Haiti is the way it is. Like, brother, like, I knew you were retarded, but like, we're gonna do this now? Like, come on, man. Like, the Haitian Revolution, even to not be racial about it, it was founded on demon worship and the slaughter of women and children. That's literally what happened. They sacrificed people, incited demons, called them down to possess them, and then slaughtered men, women, and children for the color of their skin. And Haiti still recognizes voodoo as an officially recognized religion. 20% of the population openly practices it. One of their previous presidents was a voodoo priest, self-acclaimed. And even living in Turks and Caicos, you'd find these silly voodoo traps set for people on the street with like really nice alcohol and like some money with like a candle burning. But if you take it, you're basically putting a curse on yourself. So there's all this stupid voodoo nonsense going on down there. And people wonder why this country has never had a peaceful transition of power. The last elections there were in 2017 when they elected Jovenel Moise, who was killed in a coordinated mercenary attack, because he refused to go along with the COVID agenda. So it's really tough down there in Haiti, and I don't know if this barbecue guy is going to become like the king or something, but I think their only hope is for some kind of Christian strongman to take over and, kill a lot of criminals. Of course, we see Nayib Bukele claiming to want to, go in there and, restore order like he has in El Salvador. But the reality of that is that's fairly unlikely. What is more likely is a sort of United States, coalition of Western European states. But I mean, that's been going on forever since the Haitian earthquake, since all sorts of other issues. The U.S. and others have been putting troops and humanitarian aid on the ground in Haiti, and it really hasn't led to any kind of improvement. They've been some of the highest recipients of humanitarian aid of any country. And at the end of the day, people just need to accept that a country with an average IQ of 70 is only ever going to get to a certain level, and they need to be ruled a certain way, or else this is what's going to happen. The complex trappings of bureaucratic democracy, that's not what's going to make Haiti work. It needs something a little more firm, a little more, iron-fisted. And I'm not saying that they should be ruled by anybody else. Let the Haitians rule the Haitians. But this idea that in the short term that it wouldn't even necessarily be better for the Haitians, for the white man to come in for a little bit, that's ridiculous. I have no interest in that. But what I do have an interest in is preventing the people that are currently eating their fellow countrymen in their capital city from coming en masse to my country. And I think anybody can get behind that, because that's the big problem right now. I don't need a bajillion of these people into Florida to get bussed into the interior of the country and start eating people there. So let's do what we can to prevent that from happening. If that even means, just doing nothing and building a seawall and mining it, that's okay. And I'm sure Hinkle and Haas would find some reason to, disagree with that as well, because apparently the only thing to do is just, I don't know, give them unlimited money and, elect some black communist and that'll make it all better, right? But the ridiculousness of the whole MAGA communist thing is really showing through in the Haiti situation. But I think the moral of it really is, don't found your country on demonic, exercises and, demonic rituals, because you will be dooming your nation to bloody conflict and chaos and degeneracy for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the country itself, just like the Bolsheviks in Russia built the Soviet Union on these sort of Talmudic Marxist principles, simply couldn't last very long. And similar in Haiti, which was founded on the most vicious Enlightenment sort of culture and theories, right? Essentially, politically copying the French Revolution, sort of word for word. And in fact, even the first emperor of Haiti, who only reigned for a couple of years, he actually was crowned. He was crowned in September 1804. And Napoleon was crowned Emperor of France in December of 1804. So essentially just a few months before Napoleon himself. So we can see this kind of copycat type of structure. And Haiti became sort of independent just during the French Revolution. When the French Revolution was essentially tearing the French Empire apart and Roman Catholicism was falling, we see this demonic uprising of this voodoo liberation taking place on the island. Now, I just want to mention real briefly, like this idea that liberation from slavery during the Haitian Revolution, which a lot of these modern communists and liberals are saying was a good thing. It's like, we don't disagree. Slavery, of course, is unnatural to the human condition. But if you have a look at how Orthodox Christian countries dealt with slavery, phasing it out sort of stage by stage without causing these tumultuous social events to take place, without taking into account all of the complexities, including even the eventual abolition of serfdom. And serfdom is not even slavery, essentially. Serfdom is essentially the reality we live in today, by the way, with our mortgages and our sort of long-term debts, which we hold on essentially in most of the first world and the Western world, by the way. So even as Russia abolished serfdom, which took several decades of long-term economic planning, they did so very delicately. But what we see in Haiti is, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the first emperor of Haiti, as well as all these other bizarre black as well as local Haitian revolutionaries, when they rose up against the French colonialists, who we're not saying these people were good. They were, on one hand, either Roman Catholic, imperialist, colonialist, and also slave masters, but they held society in some sort of order. The way they rose up against them, well, they, not only cannibalism ensued, but also massacre, mass rape, essentially what we see taking place, the crimes that Israel is committing against the Palestinians, the Haitian people committed against the French who were simply living there, including very innocent French people. They killed children, women, men indiscriminately. So the Haitian Revolution is really something worth reading about, because as Alexander Dugin said, who you mentioned, Conrad, he said that democracy in Haiti began with a demonic voodoo ritual, which actually did take place when Haiti was proclaimed liberated from the French colonial white man's interest. They had this massive voodoo ritual take place. So the entire this sort of foundation, if your country is based on that, there really isn't a future sort of going forward. You do need some sort of you do need a consecration of some sort. And as you mentioned, yes, correctly, if Christians would take hold here, but unfortunately, I think even El Salvador's president Bukele, he's focused very much on internal growth in his own country, and nobody would even allow him to have some sort of intervention, even despite the fact that all these countries are somewhat, I would say, Latinized. But in fact, Haiti is, I guess, a French country, and El Salvador was very Spanish, sort of, in that a bit of a different realm. But given the fact that they're all very close, they're not going to allow Bukele to do anything here in Haiti. I think at most it'll probably be involving the U.S. And again, this is the U.S.'s backyard, Conrad. This event really does remind us of maybe the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Cuban Revolution, when the U.S. began sort of getting involved and using its foreign policy interests in sort of stirring up that particular region. But again, yeah, it's just bizarre that on the ground we see essentially gang members take over so quickly, right? We see the rapper we mentioned, 26-year-old gang member named Izzo, who has a YouTube channel and he releases rap videos. Now he's leading one of the largest resistance gangs, to Barbecue's gang, which you mentioned earlier. And Barbecue himself, he's I guess he's like the new prime minister of Haiti. He wears a giant Masonic pendant on his neck with the Masonic G, and it's just bizarre. And we've seen him, wearing one pendant, and then of course the pendant increases in size, so he's getting these large Masonic blings on his neck, and it's just, okay, these are the new sort of Haitian voodoo warlords who now rule this particular island. And for us Orthodox Christians, this is not the multipolarity we support. This has nothing to do with multipolarity. This is just a descent into barbarism and descent into savagery. And by savagery, I mean Sodom and Gomorrah level savagery, where it's a falling away from the sort of Edenic Adam state, falling away from any sort of Christianity. And in fact, none of these revolutions, local, historically, as well as in the modern context, are ever Christian inspired. Notice it's always either Marxism or paganism or some sort of bizarre post-Enlightenment liberalism. So yeah, the prospects for Haiti in the future, they're not looking very good, unless of course there is some inspiration from the inside to actually take up arms and actually set up law and order. And as you mentioned, criminals will need to be executed en masse. I mean, there's people will need to be imprisoned, exiled, or even sent to forced labor camps, and until things are set straight, because again, you can't let these people run around and hurt innocents in the country. And this is where pacifism completely falls through as a sort of Christian heresy doctrine, because again, without adhering to this doctrine, you'd have to allow whatever's taking place in Haiti to go forward. But again, it's curious that something like this would be taking place in the context of the brewing Third World War, and it's kind of as it's going off again, this unrest in, we mentioned South America earlier last year, but again, even in the Caribbean islands, things are just getting a lot worse for the local people there, because the instability is falling apart. This isn't the end of history like Fukuyama told us about. He lied. He made up a story. History continues on, and even for these local countries in the Caribbean, transformations are coming.
No, it's very frightening, especially, in theory, where I live in Texas, it's on the Gulf of Mexico, maybe they'll make it all the way over there. And, we already have enough of a problem. I mean, there's Haitians and Africans flying up through the southern border already. So we don't need the water border open with this whole Haitian situation, but we're watching it closely, of course. But I think moving away from that, we can move into the world of church news, which there's a decent amount this week. Of course, Patriarch Neophyte of Bulgaria, he reposed, which is big news. He had apparently been sick for some time, and every parish in Bulgaria had been praying for his good health, and now he has reposed, and there will be a fairly, I believe, quick election of the new Bulgarian Patriarchate. It seems that within 7 days, I believe, at least some of the nominees need to be released, and then within a certain amount of time, they will hold an election. And I remember reading about the election procedure. There's a bunch of representatives from the diocese, all the dioceses, and then the Diocese of Sofia, the capital, gets slightly more representatives, and there's each of the dioceses send at least 2 lay representatives as well for the voting. So it's all going to be going down, and that means a new patriarch of an autocephalous church is coming. So on the show and on our social media, we'll be sure to keep you posted on the candidates and what they think, and what direction they may take the Bulgarian church if elected, and we'll be following that very closely. But in other church news, of course, there's the situation with Romania, Moldova, and Russia, which is continuing as the Moldovan church is trying to kind of start a dialogue between the two sides, while at the same time the Alexandrian Patriarch condemns Russia for their Russian exarch in Africa, which Russia is ignoring, of course, as Alexandria seems to be, more than anywhere else, even more than most of Greece, seems to be the one siding with the ecumenical patriarch the most on the Ukraine situation, which is very unfortunate. But Dimitri, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the updates and anything going on between Russia, Romania, and Moldova and all of that. Of course, last week we talked about, the new Romanian parishes in Ukraine. It seems that the synods of these churches have kind of started talking about this.
So again, on the Moldovan angle, right, we have the Romanian church expanding in its Bessarabian metropolis. So Metropolitan Vladimir of Chisinau, Moldova, has actually called on the Synod of Romania to actually come to the table and discuss some of the issues, which the first issue which he called on Romania to talk about in his particular diocese was that, well, you have to consider that a lot of Romanian clergymen are living in Moldova, actually, who were firstly under Metropolitan Vladimir, were actually considering going into the Romanian Orthodox Church, but some of them are actually either they defrocked, temporarily suspended, or under sort of the investigation of clerical court, which still needs to sort of take place, and still an order needs to be carried out in the metropolis of Chisinau, which of course belongs to the Russian Orthodox Church. And he's stating that they're dodging their sentences, dodging their penances, and essentially avoiding any sort of issues by joining the Romanian church and leaving the Russian Orthodox Church. So as you can see, it's similar to what took place in Florida when that one particular Rocor priest took his entire parish into the Goak, I believe, and there was that big scandal that took place there in the Americas. A similar thing is happening in Moldova at the moment. And Metropolitan Vladimir of Chisinau, who belongs to the Moldovan Russian Orthodox Church, he simply wants Romania to come to the table to kind of discuss this and sort of explain things. And the second issue, of course, he says that, well, the Moldova as a country and Transnistria and all these areas, they're quite poor. Meanwhile, the Romanian country is one of the only Orthodox jurisdictions which actually pays its priests quite a large salary. So priests are actually paid a lot more than Moldovan priests are, and Romanian the incentive for clergy in Moldova and Transnistria is to join the Romanian church. Again, the monetary sort of incentive is there. So he's stating that there shouldn't be any monetary incentive to decide which jurisdiction you go into, especially if you skip jurisdictions or if you're already an ordained clergyman. You simply can't move just because they pay you more. But he's saying that enticement is there, and that needs to be discussed very openly. Meanwhile, again, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Synod in Moscow, has passed a resolution stating that they condemn any sort of Romanian expansion into Ukraine, Moldova, Transnistria. They still do not see it as canonical, and they've actually brought up a long, lengthy series of canons where they've stated that the Russian integrity, the jurisdictional integrity of the Russian Orthodox Church is being abused and is being breached by the Romanian Orthodox Church. So they've come out completely against the Romanian Patriarchate and some of its actions. So again, we do see this conflict brewing, which we spoke about last year, but again, it was very hypothetical last year and very much in the speculative realm, although me and Conrad did kind of foresee this taking place because this is one of those hot areas on the border between the Russian world and I guess the world of Central Europe, which has always been, technically speaking, if you've read about the history of the 20th century, this has always been an area of contention. So it's just sad that two Orthodox local churches are butting heads amidst all of the globalist and liberal-led conflict. But again, this is the work of the devil, and hopefully there will be some sort of agreement that both churches come to in the end and some discussion. Yeah, as you said, Bishop Constantine, the new exarch of Moscow in Africa, has been excommunicated by the Alexandrian Church, which is just a little bit funny. Whilst last week we mentioned the Archbishop Leonid, the former exarch of Russia in Africa, is actually just chilling as just is a bishop in retirement, despite the fact that he's in his early 50s. In terms of further persecution news, more disgusting footage, of course, released always on Ukrainian TikTok. And again, this big TikTok discussion is very interesting in the US, but the Ukrainians are abusing TikTok to the point where they're posting videos of desecrated churches. Sitting on the bishop's throne in the altar itself, we see a Ukrainian man holding 2 machine guns and a Ukrainian rap song being played in the background. It's just the desecration, again, locally in Ukraine, in the SMO zone, we only see it from the Ukrainian side. So when people say this is an even conflict, it's a conflict between Christian brothers, it is a civil war. Patriarch Kirill has called it a civil war. Putin himself has called it a civil war. It is a civil war of some sort, of a type, But again, we do see these abuses being perpetrated by the fact that Ukraine is a heavily, and this is an ongoing process, heavily de-Christianizing country because its government, its elites, its monetary, political, military elites are not Christian. So of course they're promoting this anti-Christianity onto the base population as well as the men who are in the Ukrainian military itself. And so again, canonical Ukrainian chaplaincy and military priests are banned from serving in the Ukrainian military right now. They're trying to pass that law to sort of exclude them from actually serving services and Ukrainian priests from actually serving the Ukrainian men, baptizing them, confessing them, communing them. So again, the entire state is actually acting against the interests of the Ukrainian people. So it's just incredibly concerning because it does touch upon their Orthodox Christian conscience and as well as their lives. It's just a little bit tough at the moment in that area of the world, which is why we always call people for prayer. But what can we say? I mean, we'll be covering it as until it ends and even its resolution going forward.
No, definitely. And speaking of, bishops and these types, obviously I'm here at the, Eighth Ecumenical Council conference learning all about how, even back in 800, the Pope, was doing all sorts of things, trying to, extend his authority where it wasn't, and how, it was understood in the Orthodox conception from day one. But today's Pope, Dimitri, you mentioned earlier how France is no longer under Roman Catholic influence. Well, frankly, maybe if it was, they wouldn't be making these stupid foreign policy decisions, because at least Pope Francis has come out and said that Ukraine should surrender, which he's actually, like, Pope Francis is, I guess, using his, his clerical immunity he has to not get blown up by another country to kind of just come out and say what no other leader is willing to say. So, when he gets it right, he gets it right. So I'll call out Pope Francis for being consistently pro-peace to the point where, he's like, yeah, obviously Ukraine has to surrender. Like, are you retarded? So it's, we love to see it, which is just so funny because this comes right after, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Shevchuk, they came out and were like, we're not obeying fiducia supplicans. This does not apply to the Eastern Church, basically just saying, yeah, but we're Orthodox, not Catholic, despite the fact that you are under the Pope. You do affirm that he is, the universal infallible bishop. So I don't know why you think you can just not do what he says, but, Pope Francis, in the midst of all of that, then he's like, oh, you guys have to surrender. So he's kind of just been piling L's on the UGCC, since he's weighed in on the conflict. So very interesting development there. Yeah, so before we end, you mentioned the TikTok situation, and here in the States, everybody is getting played and sold this bill of goods that this is a China thing, it's Chinese spyware, and it really has nothing to do with that. Of course, TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company, but the reason they want to ban it is because pro-Palestine, anti-Israel content has been going viral ever since October 7th, like millions and millions of impressions. That combined with the fact that the TikTok algorithm and the app in general is just so much better than US-based social media, that it's starting to beat out Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and these other places for engagement and amount of users. And it's very international as well. So it's become this sort of international anti-Israel propaganda tool. And, the Jews in the US just can't have it. And Biden himself has said that he's willing to sign it. So it really shows that this goes all the way up to the top. And, in the midst of all of this, we've seen the Rabbi Shmuley versus Candace Owens thing that has kind of developed, as Candace Owens has really come out fairly anti-Israel, and Rabbi Shmuley is, I think he's on a mission to make every single person in the world anti-Semitic with his behavior. But we're seeing kind of this TikTok thing kind of break down. And even Trump actually came out against the TikTok ban. So that shows you that maybe Trump isn't 100% about to just throw his hat in with Israel. But it's a pretty interesting development, to say the least. But it's kind of all over the news cycle, so I don't think you need us to bring you a whole lot of more information on that front. But unless you have anything to say on the TikTok situation, Dimitri, we probably should mention our good friend Andrew Tate, because we just talked about Romania. I'm wondering what awaits him and his brother. What's going to happen? Are they going to get extradited to the UK?
Well, very possibly. I think Romania definitely, I think, wants to get rid of them very soon, especially with these tensions building with NATO and the EU, and they simply don't want somebody who. And despite the fact that Andrew Tate is, he does lead this very degenerate lifestyle to this day, and he did convert to Islam, just bizarre things like that. But his brother Tristan, he married the daughter of a Romanian Orthodox priest, so I'm not sure if he actually wants to move away. It's just a very interesting situation there. But nevertheless, I think the UK definitely has this sort of idea of capturing certain people, bringing them onto their own territories, and leading these sort of fictitious judicial, I would just say Talmudic jurisdictional actions against them. Like the judiciary over there is very corrupt, as we've seen with Julian Assange, as well as several other people, and them sort of protecting even criminals such as Berezovsky, for example, in the past. It's just there's a long trend of the UK actually serving forces of darkness. So it does surprise me that even people who are very far from orthodoxy, such as the two Tate brothers being extradited, I'm sure there is something to it in terms of geopolitics, but I think mostly it's just simply that they don't want two of these people with a large audience on one of the border countries, of course, on one of the NATO border countries, which we spoke about. I think there is this geopolitical element to it. I won't speak about their guilt or innocence at this point. I haven't really done much reading into it, but it's just a very interesting story. And it does tie into TikTok again because both the Tates got very popular from their TikTok clips, which they've had a whole army of clippers making clips from their podcasts and shows, which again, I think we encourage you guys to do the same if you can. Post clips of the show, sort of voiceover over certain clips and events videos that take place in world news. I think it's just a good way of actually spreading the message, in fact, and not some message supported by the Tates, but actually an Orthodox Christian view on geopolitics. I think it'll go a long way forward. So I think that's probably my limited opinion, but it doesn't surprise me. Like Romania is, despite the fact that it's a majority Orthodox country, it is very much in sort of under this influence of NATO, of the EU, of the globalist powers. It is very much just like Greece. It's a country under the globalist subjugation. And until it liberates itself, we really can't speak about an impartiality of it, even in regards to some domestic criminal affairs, such as the case of the Tates. And that's just the sheer reality on the ground here. I mean, if Codreanu was alive today, and we did an entire show on Eighth Hour about Zelia Codreanu, the hero of the 1930s in Romania, he would be sitting in a Romanian prison today. There's no doubt about that. So just keeping in mind, Codreanu would be persecuted today in modern Romania. So the Romanian political and judicial system is, I guess, unfair just by default. And that's just very unfortunate because we can't really make out what the truth is, especially from an outside perspective.
I think that's about my take as well. I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I guess we're nearing the end of the show here. I want to finish on a few notes of good news. Of course, in my home state of Texas, they passed a law that mandates age verification to visit porn websites if you're underage, of course. And, well, rather, if you're underage, you would then not be granted access to the porn website. And Pornhub and its parent company, MindGeek, that owns a few other companies, have decided to pull out of Texas entirely, which is extremely based. And it shows you that these laws really do, hit these disgusting porn companies where it counts, because, it basically cuts their revenue in half, because so much of their visitation is from young children getting exposed to this total garbage. So, Solomon Friedman, the rabbi who owns Pornhub and these companies, he decided it was going to affect his bottom line too much, and he just pulled out. So God bless Texas. We have a little bit less porn here now. So we love to see that, and hopefully more states can follow suit. And then some other good news, shockingly, coming out of the UK, is they banned puberty blockers in the NHS. So any kind of NHS facilities or anything working in the National Health Service can no longer give puberty blockers to minors because it causes irreparable damage, and it's horrible. It's a horrible way to mutilate a young child who's about to go through puberty. So it's good to see that from the UK. They're pretty cringe over there. The hate speech is bad. It's basically impossible to be right-wing. You get thrown in jail for putting up stickers. But every once in a while, they ban something based. They'll ban puberty blockers. They'll ban pit bulls, some of these sort of things. So sometimes they take some dubs over there in Bongland, although they're not civilizational dubs. They're just kind of, you could say that they're cosmetic dubs, but dubs nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the UK is an interesting place, and there definitely will be some, we spoke about transformations. The UK will definitely undergo that, I think, in the near future, especially with the illness of the king, the death of the recent Rothschild, as we mentioned last week, and some of the future developments going forward, especially with the instability economically of the entire Eurozone. The UK, of course, leaving the EU, but staying within NATO, and the instability following the presidential elections in the US, essentially who will be contributing mostly to NATO, especially if Trump's anti-NATO stances kind of move forward post-2024. Some huge developments, and of course the UK is always that really mysterious Albion Island, which will kind of stay there in the zone of interest, I think, not just of the show, but historically it's always been present and kind of in a dark way looming over world affairs. I think that's just been kind of unavoidable, even to a larger extent than France, which is why probably Emmanuel Macron is trying to really escalate things, as we've talked about on the show. But I think kind of moving towards sort of conclusive thoughts, lots of big debates happening online today. There was that really interesting Lex Friedman debate, which took place about Israel. I think for those interested in the conflict, it's probably worth checking that out in order to just have a little bit of a grasp on the historical takes. I think that was quite bizarre. Finkelstein essentially completely humiliating that YouTube streamer Destiny. Conrad, I'm not sure if you saw that debate or at least a portion of it. I thought it was quite entertaining.
Yeah, I saw some clips. It was pretty funny.
Yeah, so like events such as this, there's a lot of content which is not World War Now related, but we would recommend, of course, to some of our listeners. If you guys are interested in those sort of subjects, I think we'll continue to make those recommendations going forward. And Conrad, you're at the conference. I mean, there's some great presentations taking place. People are talking about geopolitics as well as the 8th Ecumenical Council. It's just big events are taking place in real time. This is not LARPy. This is not a world of hypotheticals, of speculation, of things taking place in theory or just in the books. Actually, the world is changing before our very eyes. And I would say moving towards a new Orthodox Christian renaissance moving forward. I think we're seeing that, and you're seeing it in person right now, I think, this weekend.
No, it's a fantastic conference. It's great to be here. Heard, again, some amazing speeches. Craig Trulia talking about his book, The Papacy. We've got some great priests here and everything. So it's very a beautiful place. I didn't know that Alabama had this kind of huge lakes and this natural beauty. So it's great to be here. Maybe I'll talk a bit more about this in a future episode or on an Ether Hour or something. But yeah, it was fantastic to be able to ask Metropolitan Neophytos a question, and maybe he'll be coming on the show sooner rather than later. Support the show, and everything, and maybe you'll see that around the corner, because that's one of our big goals on the show, is to talk to His Eminence, our hero here on the show. But yeah, Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say, I think we could probably start wrapping it up. Of course, be sure to follow us on Twitter, @WorldWarNow_. Follow us on Substack, worldwarnow.co. worldwarnow.substack.com also still works. Get behind the paywall, get access to all the Ether Hours. Listen to our recent episode this past week with Dr. G.M. Davis. We discuss his book, Antichrist, The Fulfillment of Globalization, and we have over 40 minutes of it for free on Substack and YouTube, so be sure to check that out. But get behind the paywall as well, because there's another 40 minutes of uncensored conversation with him, and he gets into some really, really fantastic stuff about Antichrist and some of the current situation, even in the Holy Land in Russia and some of these other things. So be sure to check that out. That'll all be, of course, in the description and everything down below. Put your email in, just subscribe to get every episode in your inbox, worldwarnow.co. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. Follow me on Twitter @GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri @OCanonist. Subscribe to us on YouTube, like the videos. Liking the videos on YouTube really helps us out, of course. Share the videos with YouTube, with Substack. Share them with all your friends. It really helps us out. We're going to shout out maybe some of our biggest referral people who, share with their friends and stuff. We may start doing that, so get on that. Follow us on Rumble as well. It's a good backup to have. And with all of that, I think that's everything. Dimitri, I'll let you say the last words.
Yeah, just want to briefly mention a young friend of ours, a listener of the show, Nico Nikolaos, has fallen ill. So thoughts and prayers with him. If you can just spare a quick prayer for the young man. His family is going through some very trying times. He's been diagnosed with a pretty horrible illness, and just before Great Lent as well. So very testing, and we hope that he gets through it as well as his family. So prayers and thoughts for that young fellow. And again, we are going into Great Lent, so I do ask with forgiveness just before Forgiveness Sunday. So forgive me, any listeners, anybody sort of going through this information, for any thoughts, words, and deeds which I may have done against you. I do not hold any grudges against any enemies, and I want to go into this Great Lent with a clear conscience. I think that's very important. And even people like Haas Hinkle, those people who we've had feuds with and debates and sort of fought against them on Twitter or in the virtual world, in the informational war world, there's no grudges. It's nothing personal. It's a war of ideas. So again, just asking everybody for forgiveness. I think it's very important moving forward. So yeah, and I appreciate everybody for listening. Thank you for your support. It's always commendable, guys, for giving us your feedback, and we've had some great questions. The new Q&A thread will be coming up very soon, so keep an eye out on that. And a future A4Hour episode will be out discussing Conrad's trip to Moscow very in depth. So we'll be asking him all those juicy details about his travels and his perception of Moscow, the Third Rome, Russia, kind of in detail. So stay tuned, guys. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, y'all. God bless.